Hello, 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 and
And
welcome.
hello.
Welcome back to another episode of the Corona Spotlight 2020. I am your host, Gayle Nicholson, and I am so happy to see you once again on a Monday morning. We're doing another week of this. I'm so excited. We've had quite a crazy weekend, and strangely enough, it's so not coronavirus related. However, it directly speaks to the field of work that my guest today does, and that would be disaster mitigation. How do we keep these horrible, horrible things from happening? So let me bring him on right away and let's get to this conversation that I am so excited to have. Please help me welcome Mr. Josh Costner. He is a disaster mitigation advisor with Costner Continuity. You can reach him through his website at jncostner.com. Josh, thank you so much for being with us today. It sounds like it's kind of a busy weekend for you.
It's been very busy indeed.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I wanna start talking to you today a little bit about before we even get into the coronavirus stuff. Give us a little background on you. How did you get into this line of work, and what keeps you there?
Well, it really goes back to the early days. In Operation Iraqi Freedom, I had joined the military shortly before that endeavor took place, and just being a combat veteran
Okay.
and witnessing disaster on numerous scales, coming back from that combat theater, and then experiencing Hurricane Katrina shortly thereafter.
Mm-hmm.
It brought to mind the fact that we endure a lot more suffering than needs to be. If we could, and I thought, we have the technologies, it's highly advanced today, yet we still build structures, a lot of them on the same basic principle from 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So the thought occurred to me that if we can find a way to build a better tomorrow through how we build our homes, our businesses, our schools, perhaps we can create a safer place for our families.
I
You
like
look
it.
at the amount of loss that occurs through natural disasters alone every year, billions in losses. And a lot of that comes from a lack of proper planning in the original construction of everything that we build. So if we could change it, we could change the future.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, before we go any further, I just want to take a moment to say thank you for writing the check. I tend not to say thank you for your service to military people because I do recognize that some people contribute a lower amount during their service, and some people really give a lot. So what every service person has done is write that blank check made out to the government, and so thanks for signing that check, no matter what you contribute.
It's I see that it was an honor to serve, and I'd go again if they called.
Awesome, awesome. All right, so let's get back to what you were just talking about, and I want to. I'm excited about this because you're absolutely right. We do tend to still build based on engineering from over 100 years ago, and I think a lot of what the failure is not just with the Hurricane Katrina, with a natural disaster like that, destroying the infrastructure that was in place, even like after the fact when the levee fell, right? We see
Mhm.
that across the country, in so many different areas with the bridges and all of the interstates that really need our infrastructure needs help. I'll put it that way. Would you disagree?
I would not disagree.
Awesome. Um,
We did
Go
a
ahead.
case study specifically on infrastructure, and that's one of the things that I am involved in is actually infrastructure inspections. And we did a case study a few years ago involving the New Madrid Fault, which the center of it is proposed to be near the downtown of Memphis.
Okay.
all the models that we ran on the events of, let's say, a 6.5 Richter earthquake occurred there. As has happened in the past, it's been over 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But should it happen again, the infrastructure of the bridges, specifically within a 150-mile radius of there, are old, very old, and anything of that magnitude would, for the most part, wipe out the majority of the bridges in a 150-mile radius.
Wow.
So that leaves an incredible amount of people stranded, with no way to get any kind of emergency response outside of helicopters. And we don't have that many helicopters and to really cater to getting people out in a timely fashion.
Okay.
So we have to start looking at a way to redo, rebuild, and re-strengthen our infrastructure as it exists today.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Awesome. Well, not awesome, but I get your point.
Well, it's awesome that we're recognizing it,
Mm-hmm.
and thankfully there's people who are open to the discussion.
Excellent. Now, give me a little bit of an idea what we specifically are talking about when it comes to the word mitigation, right?
Well, mitigation is literally just a fancy word for lowering the impact of disasters on life, property, and assets. We employ mitigation every day in our lives. We buckle our seatbelt when we drive down the highway. That's a form of mitigation. You're lowering the impact of, let's say, a head-on collision. You're
Okay.
still going to feel the brunt of it, but perhaps you won't be thrown through the windshield.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Just a,
So
just
it
very
is
simple.
slightly different than lowering the risk. It's not going to necessarily stop that accident from happening, but it will keep you from going through the window if it does.
Perhaps yes, that's true. Mitigation embraces the idea that the disaster will come. Statistically, emergency management agencies tend to rate disasters on a year scale. You have 10-year disasters, 20-year disasters, 50-year disasters, 100-year disasters, and rated on the frequency, the size, and the scope and the impact.
Mm-hmm.
We know they're coming. We can't stop them. So our best bet is to employ some form of mitigation to lower that impact.
I gotcha.
Look at, I believe it was probably 2012 or somewhere in that realm, where Japan suffered an incredible earthquake. And the surge in the ocean, you had tsunamis and large waves coming in from that.
Mm-hmm.
It hit the Fukushima nuclear reactor there in Japan and caused the meltdown. In hindsight, through extensive study, they only had one seawall to block the water, and it was on land, and it was not that high. Now, the power plant itself was designed to withstand earthquakes, so it handled it perfectly fine. The earthquake came and went, and the nuclear center was unaffected completely until that wave hit it. Now, had there been redundant seawalls, not only on land but in the ocean floor, let's say 4 to 6 seawalls in place, it's highly likely that wave would have never made an impact the way it did.
Interesting, interesting. And having 4 or 5 seawalls in the ocean, under the water, on the sea floor, wouldn't actually add to the turbulence of a tsunami coming in. It would
Right,
actually
it would
cushion
lower
it
it.
down.
Hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, as the waves, and this is something that we studied after Hurricane Katrina. The major factor in the flooding was the seawall, the wave, the ocean surge of the storm pushing it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, as a hurricane approaches land, just the sheer strength of that is pushing the water ahead of it, and it'll raise the ocean level sometimes 18 to 20 feet. And that is what initially poured over the levees. Now, as the water's pouring over the levees, then they eroded and broke. But that storm surge was the initial cause of it. Now, studies implemented later on showed that Had we had seawalls built underneath the water,
Hmm.
it would have slowly broke up that storm surge, and we would not have had the impact that unfortunately occurred.
Now, in Hurricane Katrina's case, because of the fact that the levees had not been maintained properly as they had been scheduled to be maintained in previous couple of years from that, is it possible that even with additional seawalls, although logic would dictate if they put the seawalls in, they would have repaired the levees uh, or maintained the levees. Um, but if they had just had those seawalls and the levees were still at that corroded state, would it not have just taken a little bit longer for those levees to bust? I mean, we've got to really look at the whole picture when we're
It's possible, yes.
bringing.
It is possible.
Gotcha. Okay, good, good, good.
Once again, that's one thing we say in mitigation is you can never promise anything to be 100% disaster proof.
Right, right.
It's Mother Nature will throw the unexpected when you think you've covered all the bases, and she'll catch you unaware in a place that you never envisioned that you had a flank open.
Gotcha. Now we're talking a lot about oceans, tsunamis, hurricanes, and that type of thing, but you don't do just oceanic disaster mitigation. What is the scope of the disaster mitigation advisement that you offer?
Specifically, all forms of natural disaster, primarily. We do cover some sorts of man-made disaster. If you really need to address, if you have, let's say, a high security site that don't want any terrorist activity impacting it, we can also address that as well, which would be considered a man-made disaster.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Well, we're seeing quite a few sporadic man-made disasters this weekend, I think,
Indeed.
unfortunately, and so let me ask you this: the coronavirus itself, right? Now, we're going to leave alone whether that's a natural or a man-made disaster, but uh, what what systems do we have in place that that pandemic could be detrimental towards? Like, what kind of damage can it do in the
Well,
type of stuff that you're talking about?
pandemics affect, it's primarily the healthcare system. Uh, Initially, the initial wave of pandemics is going to directly affect the healthcare system. And as our healthcare system exists today, it doesn't take much to overwhelm it.
Mm-hmm.
The cost of operating healthcare systems is high. We have we are blessed with a tremendously amount of highly skilled doctors and nurses who know so much about health today. Unfortunately, having them on staff does require a considerable amount of money because that is extremely specialized knowledge that takes years of hard study to become an expert in. So, and then there's a lot of other factors too that raise the cost of healthcare. But you have a pandemic that comes along. Uh, the one of the major factors is panic.
Mm-hmm.
You have what's referred to as the walking well.
Mm-hmm.
They get worried, and so they feel like they have just all the symptoms of whatever it is that's engaged in the pandemic. And so they begin to flood the healthcare system. I'm worried about myself. I have these symptoms. Is there something wrong with me? And oftentimes those individuals can bog down the process of responding appropriately to a pandemic or really any kind of mass casualty incident of any type.
Mm-hmm.
But in the terms of a pandemic, panic plays a huge role. There's an ancient story from probably before the time of the ancient Greeks, honestly. A traveler is leaving a city and he comes in contact with two entities coming into the city, both extremely fearful and gruesome looking. Terrified, he asked them, "What do you want with me?" They said, "Nothing. We're traveling to this city to stay a while." And he said, "Who are you?" The guy says, "Well, I am Plague, and this is my traveling companion, Panic." The guy looks at plague and says, "Will you kill many people in the city?" And he said, "I'll kill some, but panic will kill far more."
Mm.
So the idea that panic induces more harm than anything has been around for thousands of years. And mitigation understands that. So we try to lower the impact of anything. And in this particular case, in the coronavirus situation that we're seeing, the healthcare system was perhaps not prepared in the way they thought they were, or perhaps there's still a lot that's being investigated currently.
Mhm.
Were the responses correct? Were the responses not enough? Were they too much? Was government oversight involved? Was the government overreach involved? Was media involved in overhyping the dangers? There's a lot of various things that are being looked at right now. And it will take time before we truly have the clarity of hindsight to know the truth behind every aspect.
Awesome. Now, let me ask you this because there was an awful lot of flipping around, if you will, as far as information that was coming out of Washington. Now, mind you, we've never had something of this scale ever. Uh, Closest one being in the 1918, 1920s, with I think it was the Spanish flu pandemic. But we certainly didn't have the media off the chain the way that it is lately. And we didn't have the social media. I mean, we barely had telegraph at that period of time,
Right.
right? For as far as sharing information and such. But growing up, I remember us having a clear direction from the government of this is what's going on, this is what we're doing about it, this is what we need you to do about it, that has been not present since March.
It's the double edged sword of technology. We have allowed our access to the greatest wealth of information ever collected in human history at our fingertips. And this is just my own humble perspective. I believe that we have allowed the easy access to information to cause us to become cynics, to become skeptical. We have seen experts get it wrong, and so our trust is not easily placed anywhere. That also allows for our trust to be easily misplaced as well. The power of the media plays to this. People can be portrayed as however the media wishes them to be portrayed, regardless of what the truth is.
Mm-hmm.
So this has shaded the lens through which we see it as well. So you have these various lenses that we're looking through as we seek the truth. And the lenses are scratched and cloudy, and in spite of the information being there for us, we oftentimes don't believe it or place our trust and get our information from faulty sources that claim to be the correct sources. So there's so many factors that affect it today. It's a beautiful and a terrifying thing at the same time.
Well, in a country where guilt or innocence is determined based on beyond a reasonable doubt, and we have injected doubt into every area, every institution of our lives. That sounds like quite the disaster to try to mitigate. How do we do that?
Well, I can tell you this, it's not, no matter what we implement for mitigation, we're not going to see massive impact in the next 5 years. We didn't get here overnight. We're not going to get out of this overnight. It will take many years of careful application of self-discipline from everyone involved for us to get truly back on the right path where we can drop the cynicism, drop the skepticism, drop the derogatory perspectives, if you will, that has been ultimately, sadly, the media. has jaded our views in some ways. In other ways, they have increased our ability to respond to events because now we have instantaneous news from anywhere.
Right.
Anyone can upload a video or stream it live. And so we have, dare I say it, sometimes faster reporting from individuals around an incident than we do from the actual media.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, it's hard to respond to that because we don't have all the facts. We have various entities recording and streaming, but we still don't have all the facts of a particular incident. So until we have those, oftentimes it's hard to really make a educated approach.
Oh, absolutely. Context makes all the difference in the world.
Indeed.
And without context, it can be twisted any way that it is, the receiver wants to present or wants it to be presented. Oh,
That's true.
yeah, that sounds like a sticky situation. All right, who would be the type of organization that would come to you looking for assistance, and what would they be looking for?
Well, oftentimes you'll have a company that wants to expand into a certain area. Let's say a company wants to build a new facility near the ocean front in Florida. Well, if you're going to mitigate against a variety of things, you have to look at what are the risks, what are the hazards of that region.
Mm-hmm.
You look at the historical data going back about 100 years, typically is a standard mitigation history check. You look at everything that's happened on the site where they want to build, and then you ask them what are your priorities, what are you wanting specific, because here's the risks, here's the hazards, and how do you want to approach it. And if that entity wants to do an all hazards approach, you start implementing the aspects of looking at the foundation. How are you going to build the foundation? How are you going to build the structure itself? How are you going to protect the people that come there?
Mm-hmm.
Look at your egress routes, your evacuation routes, should you ever have to evacuate for any reason in a natural disaster. There's a lot of different facets that go into approaching the mitigation applications.
And I can't imagine that anybody wouldn't want to go with an all hazards approach, but I assume, whether it's financial concerns getting in the way of what you want to do or not, are there situations where you would actually go, you know what, we really don't need to worry about this type of thing in this area, so it's a very lower, it happens, but it's such a low risk, it's not a priority. Are there situations like that?
Yeah, if a corporation or a company or business is wanting to build in the state of Washington, you're not gonna factor in the effect of tornadoes the way you would factor them in for someone who wants to build in Memphis, because Memphis
Right.
being in the heart of Twister Alley,
Mm-hmm.
that's going to be a much higher rating on the hazard scale than it would be in the state of Washington. So there are times where there's various hazards that you don't have to factor in nearly as high of a rating, if you will, on the hazard vulnerability scale.
Gotcha. Do you ever do any work in Arizona?
Not that much really. I haven't been out there in a long time. There is a possibility of having to go there later this year. I'm waiting to see what the clients choose to do.
Awesome. Well, if you figure out a way to mitigate scorpions, let me know.
Well,
Because
are you
those
talking
will,
about
they can
now
flatten
it's
under a shoe.
scorpions just outside, scorpions in the business or home?
Home.
Scorpions in the home.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there are the requirements on home sealing are not always up to what they could be, but there are ways to properly seal your home where nothing will get inside. Granted, it does take some retrofitting for an older home. If you're building a new home,
Mm-hmm.
that's very easily solved, and there's companies that can take care of that. We're looking in the technologies of concrete homes today.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, steel plate reinforced concrete homes that can be completely sealed. They're actually somewhat affordable, surprisingly. Then you have them, they're basically, you can never make the full claim that's 100% disaster proof, but for all intents and purposes, these homes are fireproof, waterproof, um, floodproof. They can be sealed completely. You might have a contents fire, you won't have a structural fire, and they'll definitely keep scorpions out.
Interesting. Very interesting. That's something to look into. Excellent. Thank you.
Okay.
So let's talk about a little bit about what is the cost of not mitigating from the beginning. What do we see?
Well, what we see, especially, 30, 40, 50 years ago, the cost was there, but it wasn't looked at closely. We just said, oh, natural disaster, tornado came, it wiped out a community. The cost really wasn't addressed that much at the time. As population has grown, though, the same natural disaster will have 10 times the cost because now we have more structures, more lives, more assets that are affected by it. So we've reached a point where severe weather and natural disasters cause an annual damage rate of over 10 billion a year in damages.
Mm-hmm.
And that's across the nation, all 50 states. So as population grows, it's statistically projected right now that within the next 25 years,
Mm-hmm.
every single human being in America will be directly affected by a natural disaster of some kind. The population is growing to that point where you can't avoid it.
Well,
So,
I'm in line for the oceanfront property in Arizona part. Yeah,
ah,
that's the natural
awesome.
disaster I'm signed up for. So make sure that happens the way I expect it to, please. Thank you.
Well, if you have some cheap oceanfront property in Arizona, I would love to hear the insider information on that. Uh, but but yeah, the cost of not mitigating keeps climbing every year. Uh, every year there are more and more billions lost, and it's because of the fact that, like I mentioned at the very beginning, we're building with technologies. You look at stick built homes
Mm-hmm.
today, they're still primarily in concept the same overall idea that was being built in the late 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, our bracketing systems, our fastener systems have improved, but the overall concept is still the same.
Mm-hmm.
So, we have a structure that's brand spanking new. Let's say someone builds a brand new home in Phoenix. Within 30 years, that structure has reached its lifespan. Its prime lifespan is over at 30 to 35 years, and major overhauls need to start being made at that point. It's
Gotcha.
the same thing that we had 100, 120 years ago. So if we turn to more disaster resistant structures, such as concrete and other types of building materials that are being explored, but specifically plate steel reinforced concrete homes, you now have a building lifespan of over 100 years before anything really needs to be addressed, typically.
Interesting. Now, are you familiar with hempcrete and how that matches up with our usual concrete?
I
what
have
are the looks
not
on that?
I have not done enough research on hempcrete to make an appropriate comparison as of yet. That is one of the products that we are planning on looking at this year.
Awesome.
But I've heard good things. I've heard very good things. And the fact that we're opening back up to the idea of hemp as being a commercial and industrial product is outstanding because in its initial boom I believe it was the 1920s, we saw that it could create paper, oil, clothing. And so it's good to see it coming back for industrial use.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed. I would love to see that more in what we normally use as, yeah, of course you're going to go with that product. You know what I'm saying? It's not something special. I would love to see that happen. So uh, here's a question for you. How do
Mhm.
you think can we change the current direction of disaster response? I mean, it's from what you've described, it sounds like our disaster response process is heading off of a cliff itself.
It has failed many times in the past few decades. The most notable failure that started this domino process was the response to Hurricane Katrina. The lack of general understanding about how response is structured today uh, is surprising. Most people don't understand the process. Um, but our entire society is permeated with the concept of it'll never happen to me
Mm-hmm.
until it does. And then it's too late. When your vehicle is rolling end over end or sideways down the highway, that's not the time to check your seatbelt.
Right.
It's not. Um, there was a former emergency manager who was well known in those circles, and he made the statement, "When disaster strikes, the time to prepare has passed." And what we're seeing is that our entire society is reactive rather than proactive, and it's merely, I don't want to say laziness, but we as a society don't want to take the time to put in that a little bit of extra effort and money up front. And it's costing us on the back end. It's like we're not investing enough on the front end, and it's biting our rear on the back end, and we're losing our rudder, losing our rumps, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
The
Yeah.
reaction, it lives are lost, property is damaged. If we could change the mentality of our society, if we could induce a paradigm shift to a mentality of mitigation, the more we implement it, the better our disaster response will become, because the disaster response will not have to be on the scale that it typically is. Now, we can put in all the change we want to, and we need to strive to be the planters of the seeds of change for the mindfulness of mitigation. We're not going to see great change in our lifetime. We're not.
Now,
But we can start the change now.
awesome. Is there another country that has more on the ball when it comes to disaster mitigation or building techniques that, you know, plan against bad things
No,
happening on the end?
no, sadly, no, sadly, not that
Oh,
I've
you're the cutting
discovered.
edge. Yay.
There are a few other countries that have maybe a company within the country that is finding cutting edge technologies to implement. But countries as a whole, we are one of the most advanced on the planet. Now, there are countries like Japan that have mastered the approach. I say master, they've become experts in the approach of mitigating against earthquakes.
Mm-hmm.
They're so prone to earthquakes in their country. That is one facet of mitigation that they've become true experts at.
Mm-hmm.
And there are concepts and designs that can be implemented to, for the most part, completely eradicate any threats of earthquakes. Now, here's the thing: cost benefit analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Does the cost make sense to the entity that's implementing it? Here's where this is what causes the breakdown
Mm-hmm.
of mitigation for the most point in most applications. The entity that is wanting to implement it does not see the cost as beneficial for the long term. So if it costs an incredible amount of money to install a counterweight pendulum system underneath the hospital to counterweight the entire building
Mm-hmm.
in the swaying of an earthquake, if that costs tens of millions of dollars, the entity building the structure may choose not to employ that. So, therefore, it really comes down to the client, the entity that's choosing to employ the various mitigation tactics. Do they want to spend the money? And most of the time, the answer is no. That's why we still are building on the same concepts that we were 100 years ago. largely, especially in neighborhoods, communities, residential structures for
No.
sure. We've moved on to more steel structures in the industrial realm, but even those are still susceptible to fire and flood. So we really need to explore the fact that we will have to tighten our belts. We'll have to live a little more closer to the chest, if you will, to invest it up front so that people down the road don't suffer the same fate that we've been seeing, but are that will have to come from a mental paradigm shift completely across society as a whole.
Awesome. Well, I've got theories on where America is in its developmental hierarchy, and we're right about 13 years old with way too many Apple products. Just a spoiled teenager going, I'll do my homework later, and, you know, the train wreck is about to happen. You know?
Yeah, we're going to go through some challenging times, and we're really going to have to face some cold hard truths about changes that need to be made so that we can have a better future for the next generation. This generation is really going to, for lack of a better term, suck it up and put the nose to the grindstone to create a better future. We in America, we still have the greatest system that's ever been created, but we've grown complacent and we've allowed evil greed to cause us to be calloused in a lot of ways and allow things to fall by the wayside. And I say evil greed specifically because there are good types of greed, um, but evil greed, those that seek to have gain at other people's loss purposefully, we've allowed that to become too mainstream, and we're just going to have to make some changes as a society.
Yeah.
Paradigm shift must come.
Agreed. Agreed. And hopefully that idolization goes away as it does. Yeah, definitely. Now, do you have any final thoughts that you would like to share with our audience before we send them off into another week of life here during the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, in dealing with the fallout of the pandemic, a lot of people have lost everything that they had. So we need to, of course, never be a doormat, but be kind in your responses to people. That's one thing that I feel like we as a society also have begun to lack, is our kindness and our responses to each other. We've become a screw you kind of an attitude when really we could just change our tone and the day would be much better for so many more people. So whether you're dealing with mitigation, whether you're on the front lines in the emergency medical response, or whether you've lost everything, we're in this pandemic together. So we need to understand that. And each person is fighting a battle that we know nothing of. So let's try to be respectful and kind in our approaches to each other.
Wonderful words. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for what you're doing, Josh. I appreciate your contribution to a better life and a better future on this planet.
Thank you. It's an honor.
Take care.
Thank you.
When you actual energy work makes that recovery progress so much faster. That recovery is possible. You do not have to live as a victim until your last days. You have unbelievable strength, and I know that because you're still here. Do you want to create something completely unrecognizable with your life? I can show you how.